With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today. Simply go to tntradio.live. Perception versus the truth. This is Connecting the Dots with Matt Ehret on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
All right, welcome to this week's episode of Connecting the Dots on TNT Radio. I am your host, Matthew Ehret. I was expecting to speak today to my first guest, Vanessa Beeley, who is an intrepid journalist who has worked all around the world in the hot spots, the hottest of spots. Unfortunately, sometimes when you're working as a gumshoe journalist and somebody who's on the ground, these spots can get exceptionally hot to the point that bombs fall on the city that you're in. So Vanessa has been based in Damascus now for a couple of years. And this morning, there were some Israeli strikes that did a lot of damage to certain residential buildings very close to the South African embassy, I just noticed as well. I think that was actually one of the closest buildings to the strike was the South African embassy, probably not a coincidence. But that being said, the internet access has been highly reduced. So we might have Vanessa join us. She's keeping track of her internet access, but this, she says, always happens every time there's an Israeli strike. The internet goes down. So fingers crossed. Until then, I figured I would just speak a little bit about some thoughts, some things that I've been researching and looking at. Certain items that I was going to bring up to Vanessa's attention as well during our conversation, but I'll just share my thoughts on it. And again, hopefully she can chime in a little bit later on. The number one thing that I think is important is that as we speak right now, there is a summit happening at Davos. This happens every year. This has been going on since 1973 or 71, really. It was originally a cardboard cutout selected as a little sociopath who was a student of Sir Henry Kissinger. And I said Sir Henry Kissinger not by accident there. I'm not giving a little cheeky jab. He was knighted into the knighthood of the Knights of St. Michael and St. George in 1995 for services rendered to Her Majesty and the interests of the broader British Empire. This is something that was also This has been given to a variety of high-level managerial stooges for the empire since the 19th century. So Henry Kissinger has been a very hyperactive fellow over the unfortunately long life that he had lived. And after doing certain things, being initiated into the Council on Foreign Relations, editing their major journal, Foreign Affairs, in the 1950s, working very closely with Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, he rose to become a steering committee member of the Bilderberger Group that was initiated by Prince Bernhard, who worked very closely as a former Nazi SS officer with Prince Philip, both of whom created the World Wildlife Fund. That is, the World Wildlife Fund for Nature was created by both of these oligarchs. And also they were working with another eugenicist named Sir Julian Huxley in the 1961 in order to shift society's values away from ending empire and making life better for humanity towards saving nature from humanity, with the arch nemesis being supposedly human population growth and technological progress that allows population growth to happen. So this is the sort of environment that Kissinger was groomed in. And when he was overseeing a CIA-sponsored program at Harvard, there was a young German-speaking sociopath named Klaus Schwab who displayed some talent and had certain family connections as well that made him useful, and he was deployed to set up the Davos, a meeting that would happen annually at Davos in Switzerland, and it grew to become called the World Economic Forum. Soon, the third meeting was hosted by none other than, not hosted, patronized, funded by Prince Bernhard himself, who also brought in the Club of Rome, a David Rockefeller-funded program as well, that had begun to shape the idea that all national policy about the future, especially regarding resources, have to be presumed to be understood through extrapolations of data in the present without any consideration made for technological progress. So the Club of Rome computer models were brought into the World Economic Forum in 1973, overseen and funded by Prince Bernhard. And ever since then, this thing has been sort of an organizing group, as sort of a junior partner of the Bilderberger Group. The Bilderberger Group, you got to be sort of a much higher level insider. I think it only allows 200 or so on average participants every year. Davos in the thousands. It's many people are there who are degenerate, who are just there to get high-end caviar, overly priced champagne and hookers, and a lot of drugs. That's what some people are there for, is for the party. Other people actually are going there because it's an intersection of government as well as private enterprises, leaders of industry, and they can do deals very efficiently to make a lot of money happen, make a lot of business deals. That's authentic. But then you've got this other thing. I think you've got groups within groups. And then there's this other thing involves a technocratic death cult, which has been organizing to try to prepare for a crisis that they put into motion when Henry Kissinger played a big role with other trilateral commission members in the early 70s, David Rockefeller, George Shultz, later Paul Volcker, also trilateral Federal Reserve chairman, who called for a controlled demolition of the world economy would be a desirable outcome of the 1980s, as he gave in a 1978 speech. Now, these trilaterals and around Kissinger and Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski was another one, worked very closely together to try to ensure that a once viable, productive industrial economic system would be systemically changed as a paradigm, such that value would be tied to a consumer set of metrics, that to be a good citizen meant to be a good consumer, no longer would it be a good producer, a good creator, which was the former ethos. And by being a good consumer, it also meant thinking about yourself first, thinking less about your future, your past, your nation state, your world, and thinking more about just filling ever increasing voids in the shopping mall, whatever you want, getting into Visa credit card debt in order to satisfy ever growing wants. And that became the accepted new identity for people, while at the same time they stopped paying attention to who was taking over their government, over the dead bodies of people like Martin Luther King Jr., of Bobby Kennedy, of earlier John F. Kennedy, of Fred Hampton, of Malcolm X, even everybody who exhibited a certain quality of insight and moral leadership had to be killed in America in order to allow for the growth of this cancerous deep state, which was always there, but all of a sudden people weren't keeping it in check. They didn't care as much. And that disengagement of the citizenry into thinking small, thinking about my personal happiness, my personal immediate people I can sense with my five senses. That's all that people. The more that people just thought in those terms, the more the oligarchy was able to win in taking over the power structures, military, bureaucratic, academia, everything of the governments of the formerly the former champions of democracy. Were very influential in shaping economic policy on Wall Street, on the stock exchange. Became focused entirely. Oh, I'm being told that my internet is unstable. I hope that it becomes and remains stable. But people were basically led to believe that to be an economist or to make a buck, you have to make money with increasing rates of debt. And you could speculate on those debts. You could securitize the debts. You could put insurance on the debts. And these became derivatives, or what Alan Greenspan called creative financial instruments. This became a time bomb, a built-in time bomb that people only knew how to think about in the economic realm as being what they said was the cause of value, of profit. And the real economy, the industrial base of Detroit, of Philadelphia, of the various industrial zones across Canada or Europe that we had built up from the 50s, 60s, 70s, these were atrophied. Our infrastructure was atrophied. The nation state was no longer playing a role under globalization in the economic system. It was all based on the concept that private vice is public virtue. And so we came to this giant bubble, an artificially created bubble. And I've just found out that Vanessa has been able to fix her internet. And after the commercial break, we're going to actually have Vanessa. This is great. I'm very happy. And this bubble is what has been bursting starting in 2008. There was never any systemic resolution of the crisis. It was solvable back in 2008 with the too big to fail ruptures, but instead of doing something about it, breaking up the banks, erasing the impossible to pay debts that are at the heart of the derivatives time bomb, which outnumbers the global GDP by a factor of 30 to 40 times. That derivatives bubble could have been wiped out, reorganized. The banks could have been rewired to abide by national policy for the benefit of the people, building infrastructure the way that they were assigned the mandate to do in the 19th century, in the 1930s. That wasn't done. There was no Glass-Steagall. There was no wiping out of the impossible to pay debts. And as a consequence, simply a new decade, or even more than a decade, 15 years of different types of bailouts, money printing, austerity was put into place as an architecture of green economics was built up, often managed by the same technocrats who back in the 70s had already called for the need to limit the world population down to 1 billion. We're going to talk about this in the second hour with Cynthia Chung, my wife, who's going to be on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the thesis of why there are no limits to growth in a lot more detail. But all that to say, I'm saying it in a broad stroke here. This is what was brought online. This is what they've been trying to do with the COP Accords, the COP summits every year since 2009. The Paris Accords, which China pulled out of. China also said to other nations, hey, anybody can pull out of these things. They're not legally binding in any way. The idea of reducing carbon emissions by a factor of something like some ridiculous number to limit temperature growth on the Earth by a factor of 1 to 1.5 degrees by going back to pre-1990 industrial levels, which is just absurd. It's there's no evidence that carbon dioxide even has a role to play in temperature, but despite that, they want to spend trillions of dollars in reorganizing the economy and bringing about a new type of economic system, probably after a great crisis, a systemic meltdown, at which time the idea is, on a whiteboard in an abstract sense, to then say the new idea of value is not going to be making profit or not making profit. The idea of value is no longer going to be to increase productivity of anything. It's going to be make money by reducing the carbon footprint, reduce the impact of humanity. So this idea of green bonds, green economics, it's deadly. It's a euphemism for mass genocide. And so there are a number of nations of this world right now that don't want to go down this death cult path and reduce their populations down to acceptable computer level limits. They don't want to erase their ancient civilizational heritages. In the case of India, China, we're talking about nations, civilizational states that are over 5,000 years in continuous existence with certain deep value structures that some would like to just simply reset, erase, the way we kind of did with the baby boomer social engineering experiment that caused an erasure of everything that was unacceptable before the 1960s. Pretty much don't trust anybody over 30, live in the now, just try to have a rock, sex, drugs lifestyle, and that'll be your new ethos. That was a big reset culturally, which, has certain parallels to some things that we saw destructively happen in China around the same time, except the difference was China ended their cultural revolution, and the whole cutting off of the old ethos, that was ended, and they've been repairing the damage that they had inflicted on themselves, whereas we kept it going. Those baby boomers that went through that brainwashing became the leaders of industry in the 80s and the 90s. They became the George Bushes. They became the overseers of the revolution in military affairs, who are now overseeing NATO and thinking that the universe acts like a big video game because they've all been through the doors of perception and can project their idea of reality onto the universe without any regard for the fact that the universe doesn't behave the way your wishes or your game theory models presume that it does. So all that to say, that was my rant, my opening rant for Vanessa Beeley, who we will see as soon as the commercial break is over here on TNTRadio.live.
TNT's Mark Morano.
This just in. We have a new way that's proven effective in dealing with climate protesters who deign to block highways, streets, and other public areas. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this appears to be the most effective way We have a field shot, a correspondent on the scene. Let's go to clip 4 and take a look at how to deal with climate protesters when they block your way on your morning commute. I don't want to see protests shut down, but obviously when you're blocking traffic and you're doing that, you need to be dealt with. I thought this was a great vigilante way of dealing with it.
Mark Morano on today's News Talk TNT.
I'm just going to do a little voice upgrade. 1 month on TV. I wanted to alleviate my pain. I also didn't want to be who I was. I always just felt like there was just something wrong with me, and I was trying to figure it out, and I used the internet to help me do that.
Seemingly out of nowhere, we've suddenly seen a huge spike in media depictions and social media depictions of transgenderism. It's even reached the mainstream advertising world.
The people who are consuming this are children, 13, 14, 15 years old, and it's so easy for them to literally be groomed.
I just woke up one day, looked at myself in the mirror, and asked myself, what the heck am I doing?
When trans-identified kids are referred to specialized gender clinics, they're often told that they're going to get comprehensive, multidisciplinary mental health assessments. We know that that's not true.
I was easy to manipulate.
The ideology that has become dominant at these clinics is that trans kids know who they are, and therefore to question them is completely taboo.
My childhood was ruined.
Who's there for their detransitioning? Nobody.
Nobody would help me because they had more concerns of me reversing everything.
Did this thing to alleviate this gender dysphoria that wasn't there before, but you made it into a problem, and now your body image issues are worse. That's not supposed to happen. What do we do now?
D-Trans, the dangers of gender-affirming care. For more information, go to PragerU.com.
If you're talking about it, we're talking about it. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, welcome back to TNT Radio's Connecting the Dots. I'm Matt Ehret, and I'm very, very happy that my first guest, Vanessa Beeley, was able to capture a little bit of functional internet and is joining us as promised from Damascus. Vanessa, I heard this has been a very interesting morning and evening for you.
Yeah, this morning at around 9:20 or 9:30, Israel carried out an assassination right next door to the South African embassy, which I'm sure is only a coincidence. They destroyed a 3 or 4 story building, and we are now told that there were 4 Iranian IRGC military intelligence guys assassinated. And of course, you know, they're responsible for the liaison between the resistance in Syria and the resistance in Iran. And of course, this is in retaliation for the Iranian strike on Erbil in Iraq that reportedly killed 4 Mossad members and a very wealthy Kurdish businessman who had been working on trading Iraqi oil to Israel for some time, according to reports. But of course, all of this came after Israel had already assassinated 2 IRGC commanders before Christmas, and then Ravi Mousavi, who was probably one of the most senior liaison officers with Syria. He was killed in a residential area again in Damascus on the, I think it was the 4th of January. So, and then of course the terrorist attack, which was reportedly carried out by ISIS, but I mean, we know who ISIS works for, that killed more than 100 people and injured 200 in Kiram in Iran while they were honoring the memory of Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated by Trump back in January 2020. So January seems to be the month for assassinations. And then, of course, you know, Israel and the US since Christmas have basically been repeatedly carrying out assassinations on Damascus territory, Baghdad territory, and inside Iran itself.
Yeah, and this is really shocking. You'd think that Israel would have enough on its hands just simply dealing with the mess that it created, and has only made worse every single day since October 7th, with huge significant casualties even on the Israeli soldier side. They're not doing well by any metric. But yet, despite that, it seems like they're trying to start a fight with everybody around them at the same time, with Bibi Netanyahu even saying, like, recently at Davos this week, that Iran is the key, that even if we're successful at completely achieving these wild goals of wiping out Hamas forever and all of these things, then we're not going to stop. And he said very clearly, we have to rally the world against the true cause of the axis of evil, Iran, while also bombing Lebanon and also Syria. What's going on? Like, what do you think? How do you think the strategy is going on behind his eyeballs?
I mean, I don't think there's, and I don't think it would make much difference if Bibi Netanyahu left tomorrow. I think you'd have 4 or 5 at least that would take his place and continue with the madness. I mean, Yoav Gallant, I think, made it incredibly clear about 2 weeks ago when he said, we have to have victory, otherwise we can't survive in the Middle East. And to a large degree, that's true. But what does victory mean? I mean, they don't actually have a hope in hell of victory, because they haven't been able to sustain the ground war in Gaza because of the strength of the Palestinian resistance, despite, I mean, the unbelievable genocidal bombardment of Gaza and the destruction of virtually all infrastructure, including universities, hospitals, everything, you know, that would keep Gaza sustainable has been destroyed. And now basically they're ramping up for a ground invasion into southern Lebanon, where they will confront Hezbollah. And if they can't win a ground war against the Palestinian resistance, they haven't a hope in hell against Hezbollah. And by the way, even this afternoon, there was another assassination of Palestinian resistance in quite deep inside southern Lebanon. Of course, what they're invoking is the UN Resolution 1701, which was established after the 2006 war, where Hezbollah should, you know, be operating to the north of the Litani River. But I mean, to be honest, Israel also violates the agreement because it has built watchtowers, surveillance towers, military bases on the border, just as Hezbollah has. So, you know, this is just a kind of a straw man argument to try and bring the US into the war. And that appears to be what they want to do. It reminds me very much of Ukraine, you know, this kind of let the crazies go and do the damage, and the US can stay out, and the UK can stay out, and the EU can largely stay out. And yeah, it's a little bit insane at the moment. And to what extent? I mean, I understand Iran's reaction, because you can't keep absorbing attacks against your key people, let's say, you know. So I understand them trying to create a sort of a deterrence factor, and that's exactly because the resistance axis has actually been very controlled in its response. It has basically been trying to restrict that escalation. And it's not working. Like, Israel is just continuously pushing the red line, pushing the red line, pushing the red line. And as you said, Netanyahu recently saying, you know, we'll go after Iran. I mean, it's kind of, it's insanity. And then, of course, you've got the UK and the US bombing Yemen without any congressional permission or parliamentary vote. It's just like, I don't know, like, the world has become a lawless abyss at the moment, and there just doesn't seem to be any way to scale it down, because you're dealing with irrational people in power.
Yeah, I guess that's what makes this a little bit more, like, from the standpoint of a geopolitical analysis, one makes often, I think, a bit of the we make the mistake sometimes of trying to impose logic the idea that everybody is
Yeah.
animated by logical self-interest in some manner onto the system that we're trying to evaluate. And unfortunately, when it comes to some of these belief structures that are associated with very, very influential actors, it's not purely logic. You have a really weird, perverse idea of prophecy, of some eschatological end times, bring back the Messiah by rebuilding Solomon's temple. And yeah, by the way, we're somehow the chosen people because something was written 6,000 years ago in a book written 3,000 years ago that most of our people living in Israel don't even seem to believe in. If you go to Tel Aviv, like it's a super atheistic society. And yet despite that, this is like animating decisions that they're very significant and very irrational. So very concerning.
Yeah, I mean, you're a lot more informed on that whole end times cult than I am. I tend to see you as having this amazing bird's eye view. I'm just like the little worm on the ground, like working away here, trying to figure everything out from a on the ground perspective, which is equally confusing sometimes, I think.
No, Vanessa, I mean, you're doing the most courageous type of work, and you've also been able to keep a top-down analysis. I know that some people get a little bit myopic in whenever they're like in part of like a hotspot or something, but you found a way to balance out a macro view and keep your eyes on the ground and actually talk to people and evaluate things in the process, whether it's in Palestine or whether it's in Damascus or whether it's in Ukraine, where you were not that long ago overseeing the recent elections in East Donbass. No, it's very admirable. No, but now we're come to the point where I know Blinken, because I'm trying to understand the U.S. standpoint in Washington right now. I know Blinken said something that on the surface seemed useful. It didn't seem like it was coming from a very empowered place in Davos, where he and I think the Saudis floated this idea of getting some sort of a ceasefire with some discussion opening up for recognizing Palestine as a sovereign government. It didn't take two seconds for this elaborate plan to be shot down by Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, is the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog? But I also don't know if they're playing this kind of good cop, bad cop routine. That's what it appears to be to me, because the US is playing this kind of, we don't really want Israel to do all this. Yeah, it's terrible. We have to get humanitarian aid in while they're supplying more bombs to Israel to massacre Palestinians, while they're turning a blind eye to the ongoing, much kind of quieter genocide that's ongoing in West Bank, for example, where entire areas are being flattened and destroyed and hospitals being bombed and settlements are on the increase, which of course from the 70s was the strategy started by Ariel Sharon to prevent the establishment ever of a Palestinian state. You only have to listen to another crazy Daniela Weiss when she's talking about there will never be, as you said, because of these crazy religious reasons, God has basically given them the right to completely ethnically cleanse Palestine and prevent any establishment of a Palestinian state. And when you've got Netanyahu using terminology like the Amalek, when you've got the AI selection of victims, it's basically a genocide factory generated by AI, being called the gospel. I mean, this.
I never heard this. So what is this? What is this?
It's basically they're using AI to identify victims in Gaza because the human was not fast enough to identify victims. So in other words, what it basically enabled them to do is to kill more people more rapidly and over a longer period of time, right? And this entire system is called the gospel. So, they're bringing in these incredible, as you said, cult religious analogies and terminology. So it's very clear. I mean, the Amalek term anyway was if anything else signifies genocide, that does, because it was the wiping out of the Amalek that threatened the Jesuits back in, I can't even remember how long ago. But at the same time, what the US is doing also, so this is while they're kind of paying lip service to international law on occasions, but of course they're also vetoing ceasefires from the very beginning. So the US is responsible basically for the genocide in Gaza and for the escalation, because they could have stopped it right from the very beginning. Because why is the escalation happening? Because of the genocide in Gaza. So if they had actually prevented the genocide in Gaza, we wouldn't be where we are now with this level of escalation, which is reaching a very dangerous tipping point. At what point does Iran target Tel Aviv directly? Why does Syria have to tolerate being constantly the punch bag, if you like, in the middle here? And the other thing that the US is doing very quietly and under the radar, it's developing and recruiting more ISIS fighters, both in the Huran area in Iraq and inside Syria at the Al Tanf base. There are thousands of ISIS fighters there that are being triggered to carry out attacks against Syrian Arab Army positions in the central Syrian desert area. So they're also playing their role in the escalation of destabilization, because Iraq has never recognized Israel. That's another important point. Even though the government may vacillate between wanting to kick the US out of Iraq and so on, and then wanting to maintain relationships with the US, at the same time, Iraq has had a very strong policy to not recognize the state of Israel. And we know also, of course, from the new Middle East, the clean break strategy, or the clean break doctrine, and greater Middle East. I don't think any one of them is exactly what it's going to turn out like, but it's very clear they want to reshape the Middle East. And part of that, of course, is to prevent the rise of BRICS, the rise of Russia and China, the rise of any kind of multipolar global South empowering paradigm.
Right. Yeah, I always encourage people who oftentimes people will try to evaluate global processes in a rather kinetic, linear way, looking for the causes of why a war is happening between two nations, from the standpoint of the solution being located in the region that they wish to look at, and instead of looking at the broader chemistry, the context. And it's clear that it both deals with the Middle East, so it's not like we should ignore what's going on in the Middle East. That's a spark plug, but it's important to think from the standpoint of those who created Al-Qaeda, created and deploy ISIS as weapons. It's not just to destabilize purely the governments, and rarely ever Israel itself, right? Like, when is the last time Israel has been attacked by ISIS? But rather to destabilize the entire heartland of that in which these ancient civilizations of India, of China, of Russia, of Africa intersect together in order to prevent any type of formation of a real type of resistance of strong civilizational states to the oligarchy's desires and demands for total control. So this is just a very important thing. We're going to go for a short commercial break, and we'll come right back. We're going to keep on this discussion. I want to ask a little question about Greater Israel and clean break as well. But we'll do that when we come back from a short break.
She used to dance and dream of a better life, a brighter future, with nutritious food to eat, a chance to learn, to get an education, and do incredible things. Today, thanks to Children International and friends like you, she dances for the world. Together, we give children in poverty a chance to set their sights high and achieve their dreams by ensuring that they have access to health care, education, life skills, and more, so they can grow, thrive, and believe in themselves.
Gracias. Gracias.
Learn more about Children International and join us in our life-changing work at children.org today.
The impact of a meal goes well beyond feeding our bodies. Because when people are fed, futures are nourished. Everyone deserves to live a full life. And with your help, together we can end hunger. Join the movement at feedingamerica.org/actnow.
TNT Radio. This is Connecting the Dots with Matt Ehret on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, we're back with Connecting the Dots. I'm here joined with Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, what do you say to people who have a problem with the claims made by South Africa and many, many other nations that Israel is complicit in a genocide? And people will say, this is not genocide. This is war. This is war. This is not genocide. You're conflating things. How do you respond to these types of voices that are somehow still numerous despite the evidence to the contrary?
I think, one, go and read the 84-page document that the South African lawyers put together. It's a pretty horrifying indictment of the acts carried out by Israel. But I think also check your history. From 1917 on, that was under the British mandate, of course, and then after the Balfour Treaty, basically the ethnic cleansing began, coming to a peak really in 1948 during the Nakba, the catastrophe when 750,000 at least Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from their own lands. And go and look at the map of Palestine from then on and see how it's been altered. The very fact that the UN considered that it could give 58% of Palestinian territory to an incoming settler colonial project that was effectively established by the British is just unbelievable. And not only 58% of the territory, but also the prime agricultural territory, the best territory, in other words. And if you start in 1948, then in my opinion, the genocide started back then, and it hasn't ever really stopped. You've only got to look at the persecution, the apartheid, the abuse of power by an occupying force, and it's recognized as being an occupying force. But it's an incredibly predatory occupying force. It has a responsibility for Palestinians, and it has reneged on that responsibility. October the 7th, that's not where it all started, right? And now, of course, it's kind of dribbling out that actually the majority of civilians were probably killed by their own forces, by the Israelis, either through helicopter fire on the first day, on the 7th, and then by tank fire 2 days later. They're killing their own hostages inside.
Yeah, we just had a mother, right, who just made headlines for pointing out that her son, the evidence is that her son was gassed to death in tunnels by the IDF.
Yep, exactly. And when you're talking about at least 30,000 dead, 50% of which are children, they demonstrated today they can do a targeted assassination. Okay, they can take out a 4-story building in the middle of a high security residential area. There's many embassies, there's the UN buildings. So how are they not able to do the same thing inside Gaza? If they're claiming they're targeting Hamas, why are they demolishing schools? Why are they targeting hospitals? Why are they executing women and babies? Why are they executing people trying to surrender? Why are they stealing bodies? The list is endless. They told people they had to evacuate from the north to the south, and then they bombed the convoys trying to escape the north. They're now bombing the south. Well, the south is supposed to be the safe area. It's just endless. And then if you look at the kind of micro picture of what the IOF, the crimes that the IOF are committing against the Palestinian people, including elderly, including disabled, the torture that they're being subjected to, the humiliation, all of which, by the way, were actual Nazi policies. Total humiliation, was one of the Nazi policies against the Jews and the communists and the gypsies and so on, and everyone that they persecuted. It's actually written in the Holocaust museum that this was one of the worst crimes by the Nazis. And yet, what are the IDF doing? You know, taking prisoners, civilian prisoners, as I said, elderly, disabled children, stripping them naked, humiliating them, torturing them, burying them alive.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
and then having high level officials using language like these are human animals, or there are no
There's
such
more
things.
than 500 citations now. There's a really good website called the Law for Palestine, and they've collated over 500 now citations of genocidal intent. And the incredible thing is when you watched, I think it was Malcolm Shaw, the British lawyer for Israel, and he's trying to dismiss it. These were just random assertions. No, they're coming from the Prime Minister, they're coming from the Heritage Minister who claimed we should just nuke Gaza. They're coming from the Defense Minister, literally the entire government. Yoav Gallant, you know, let's starve them, like they're only human animals. I think he's even dropped that down to animals now. And they are literally being dehumanized to an absolutely horrendous extent. 1.9 million displaced. And as I said, you know, how can anybody look at the images that are circulating on social media of children just literally being eviscerated, beheaded, bombed, traumatized, losing entire families? I mean, it's you know, it's not even.
Yeah, at this point, anybody who was on the fence at the beginning should not have any ambiguity about the moral lines at this point. You had mentioned before that I think that some viewers might not have heard about the clean break doctrine and Greater Israel as a concept, a strategic, geopolitical strategic, and very destructive concept. Could you say a little bit more to for those who may not know yet about what the clean break doctrine was and its impact on shaping policy in the Middle East, military policy in the Middle East for the past few years or decades?
Well, the clean break doctrine, I think, was in 1997. It was commissioned by Netanyahu, so you know his history in this goes way back. And I think we've talked before about his relationship to Jabotinsky, who of course was one of the early Zionists, but is an expansionist Zionist who collaborated with the Nazis in Ukraine in the 1920s against the greater enemy of the Soviet Union, you know, the Reds under the bed.
The leaders of the labor Zionists back in the 30s would call him Vladimir Hitler.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And, you know, we have to remember that Zionism, when it was kind of birthed in the late 1800s, it was described even by Jews as another anti-Semitic cult. So, you know, it has never been considered to be representative of true Judaism. And even prior to that, Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims were living perfectly, you know, coexisting perfectly in the state of Palestine. There was never an issue. So I perceive Zionism very separately to Judaism, although, as Alistair Crook has said on many occasions, 80 to 90% of the population in Israel support the actions of the government. So, but that's a vast level of indoctrination of the citizens of the occupied territory. Anyway, the clean break was basically, very basically, advocating the balkanization of the Middle East, creating sectarian statelets, which of course is exactly what the West has done in Yugoslavia and what they've tried to do elsewhere. And that would give Israel control over specific statelets. It would also give it the kind of moral authority as working with its Middle Eastern partners, which would of course include Jordan and Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the number that have normalized relations with Israel even recently under the Abraham accords. And then I think there was one statement in the clean break doctrine that mentioned that the road to Damascus was through Iraq. And so therefore, the destabilization of Iraq, as we know, came in 2003. And the Bush-Blair emails at that point are talking about, the future catastrophe in the Middle East, the potential for insurgents in Syria, but that they would attempt to create a different relationship with Syria to see if they could sort of bring Assad on board. Of course, that failed dismally. But even from 2006, there was a Time article, Syria in Bush's crosshairs, which very clearly laid out that they would motivate insurgents inside Syria to bring down the government if they didn't comply with the agenda of the West. And then if you compare that to the Greater Israel Project, it's a similar kind of plan, and even the new Middle East plan is very much taking territory from here and adding it to here, and creating states that would be US friendly by taking territory from countries that were not necessarily compliant with the US. And then Greater Israel, and this is what's astounding, was in March 2023, they call him Beelzebub Smotrich, he's the finance minister. He basically had on display the map of Greater Israel at a conference in Paris, which caused outrage in Jordan, because of course all of Jordan would come under Israel. 70% of Syria, except the top northeast corner. I think 50% of Iraq. Saudi Arabia, of course, the majority of Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is relatively happy with it, to be honest. They're already sort of, if you look at where they want to build their hideous Neom city, it's right in the top left-hand corner of that territory that Israel will take, 50 kilometers away from Eilat. It's, 170 kilometers, basically a 5-minute city. I mean, if you haven't seen it's worth taking up.
No, I did see it. Yeah, it's like a $500 billion crazy expensive city but I wasn't sure how to think about it necessarily, because it was tied to the high-speed rail being built across the Arabian desert. But you're saying that in your assessment is part of the whole 15-minute trap, right?
I think so. Yeah.
So do you think Saudi Arabia is like a Trojan horse or within the BRICS process?
Yes, I do. I certainly don't trust them. Because even now, even after the horrors of Gaza, I mean, the interesting thing, at the Emergency Arab League Summit, it was Syria and about 9 other countries, basically pretty much in that resistance axis, including Yemen, who put forward a very strong proposal to prevent oil delivery to Israel, to cut off all airspace to Israel or to any flights bringing supplies to Israel. It was about a 8-9 point proposal, and that was vetoed by Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and I think Morocco. So at that point, it became very clear to me that Saudi wasn't playing a straight game. And even now, they're putting out statements that they're quite happy to normalize with Israel if it gives Palestine a state. Well, they know perfectly well that that isn't going to happen now. It's impossible, because they've destroyed most of the Palestinian areas in West Bank. They've completely obliterated Gaza. I mean, and we know that they don't rebuild after these aggressions. They never have done. So, and I think Egypt is also pretty traitorous in this. I mean, I've had experience of that when I was in Gaza in 2012 under the Israeli aggression. Egypt is charging Palestinians, even injured Palestinians, $9,000 to get out of Gaza to hospital treatment in Egypt. And this has always been the same. In 2012, they fired on people trying to escape the bombs in Rafah. You know, and yeah, I mean, Egypt plays a kind of a dirty game as well.
It's strange because, again, like the idea of the Greater Israel would involve taking the Sinai Peninsula and probably the Suez Canal as well. There's definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's that reshaping of the Middle East, and if they are being persuaded that there are advantages for them to stick with the US and Israel. And I mean, you know, Robert Kennedy made this really clear in a statement. I think we talked about it a little while ago because I transcripted what he had said. And basically, you know, there is no compassion for the Israeli people or the Palestinian people. It's just all about geopolitics. It's all about protecting US interests of having control of resources, and Israel being the instrument to do that, which is why this reminds me of Ukraine, because Ukraine is seen very much as the instrument that is being weaponized against Russia, right?
Well,
Taiwan is being weaponized against China.
Right. And we only have a couple of minutes left. It's unfortunate, but I hope to have you back on. But on that issue of Robert Kennedy Jr. And his horrifically disappointing response to what's going on, you've written a piece that I suggest everyone read. It's on your Substack, Vanessa Beeley Substack. If you Google that, you'll find it. It's Understanding Power Dynamics and Moving Beyond Division, COVID-19 through Ukraine and Israel-Palestine. Very good paper you co-authored. Many of the people who have been very good resisting the Great Reset biosecurity dictatorship have been often very weak on foreign policy in terms of what is the enemy of America or of the collective West. And they've been tending, like Bobby Kennedy, to fall into this weird Cold War profile of supporting anything that falls into this Zionist narrative or things of that sort. They just fall apart on foreign policy, and it creates these weird divisions between elements of the left and elements of the right within the anti-Great Reset resistance, and it's very frustrating. And I know you tried to present some ideas to help heal the divide, to get people to start thinking about their better selves and what they have more in common. But it really does require that people get smarter on the issue of foreign policy and geopolitics, because you could be really good knowing that there's a deep state fifth columnist of death cultists that want to kill you, that have taken over your government over decades, but then to still use CIA, FBI talking in every other thing about what's going on outside of your little nation is weird.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit hallucinatory sometimes. It's like, how can you not see it's the same creatures that brought COVID and all of these kind of, you know, biosecurity state measures in, are the same people that have been creating dystopia for the global south for centuries. Like, how can they not understand that it is the same, and that in reality, while you're talking about CBDC, most people in these countries don't even have the access to cash, you know?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, it's a breath of fresh air to hear you speak and give your analysis. I hear the music coming on, so I think we're rounding out the end of the hour. If people want to follow you, where do they go?
Best place is my Substack, as you said, Vanessa Beeley. Telegram, the same, Vanessa Beeley. I don't have any kind of fancy name, just that.
Okay, there we go. Vanessa Beeley, thank you so much for delivering some time, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Take care. Thanks ever so much, Matt.
All right, stay safe.